So at today's hearing, it was totally dedicated to the community of eligibility. So we've had ongoing conversations since the task force first started in June of 2021 about who should be eligible for reparations for the institution of slavery. Should it be a race-based standard where all Black Californians are included, or should it be a lineage-based standard, which is particularly determined by if you're an African-American descendant of a chattel enslaved person or a descendant of a free Black person living in the United States prior to the end of the 19th century. And so we heard from public comment. We heard from at least 11 panelists on the issue, including certified genealogists and other folks. And then we had a 3, 4, 5-hour discussion amongst task force members about the question. And then we came to a resolution, and 5 task force members, which is a majority, voted in favor of a lineage-based position. And then 4 task force members voted against that lineage-based position because they've been on record favoring or proposing a more race-based system. And so the 5 people who voted in favor of a lineage-based standard include myself as the chair of the task force, Vice Chair Amos Brown, who is a pastor at a San Francisco Baptist church and was also one of Martin Luther King Jr.'s students in the 60s. Then we had Jovan Scott Lewis, who is a professor of geography at UC Berkeley. And then you had member Montgomery Stepp, who is a city councilwoman for the city of San Diego. And then you had California State Senator Bradford. All 5 of us voted in favor of a lineage-based standard. And the 4 members of the task force who voted against a lineage-based standard were members Don Tamaki, member Cheryl Grills, member Lisa Holder, and member Reggie Jones Sawyer. Why does it matter? Well, one, lineage matters. When we're talking about reparations for the institution of slavery, we're talking about a particular group of people and a particular crime against humanity, that being the institution of slavery as it was enacted and constructed in the United States. And so, that's why it's really important that we centralize lineage in this discussion, because think about it. In terms of reparations for the institution of slavery, those enslaved Africans, they were promised reparations through 40 acres and a mule, but it was rescinded through the broken promise of Reconstruction and because of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. And so those freed African slaves never got repair. And then the harms that they face kind of were transferred upon their direct descendants. So when we're talking about reparations for the institution of slavery, it's to a particular group of people, that being those freed African slaves and their direct descendants. I think to the systemic racism piece, and I call on, Isabel Wilkerson's Pulitzer Prize winning book Caste, where she explicitly states, in order to dismantle racism, you first have to address the caste system in this country, which is built on the bones of those slaves and their descendants. So we can acknowledge, right, that all Black people in this country do face some type of anti-Black discrimination in some point of their lives, right? No one is debating that. But we're talking about reparation for the institution of slavery that is particularized for a particular group of people. And reparation for the institution of slavery isn't necessarily about anti-Black discrimination per se. It's about resolving and offering repair for a specific crime under international law, that being the crime against humanity that was the institution of slavery and the lingering negative effects of that institution as it's applied to the direct descendants of those enslaved. Today's vote was major. I think, there's an understanding that, so goes California, so goes the nation. And so this vote, declaring a lineage-based standard for reparation for the institution of slavery will set a precedent for any other state-based reparations task force that might be constructed in the near future, but definitely for a federal effort for reparations, because I think all serious reparations to understand that it's the federal government's responsibility to provide reparations to the descendants of enslaved Africans. States do have their own role and responsibility in terms of offering reparations, but it's the federal government by and large that's responsible. And so that's why this vote was so important today, because we set a precedent in the state of California that we are centering in the conversation around repair for the institution of slavery who should be centered, and that are the descendants of enslaved Africans or the descendants of American slavery. And that message will reverberate throughout the country and eventually will be applied to any federal reparations effort that's to come. So actually, the task force has been meeting virtually since June of last year. And today and tomorrow will mark the end of our virtual meeting. So our next meeting will be April 13th and 14th in San Francisco, and it'll be our first in-person meeting. So stay tuned for information on that because it's coming shortly. So tomorrow is the second day of our March hearings, and tomorrow is dedicated to hearing expert testimony and personal testimony on issues surrounding criminal justice, anti-African American hate crimes and bias, and the history of policing and the war on drugs. And then we'll also hear from our economic consultant team, who will be providing us with some information so that we can get the ball rolling in terms of compensation models. How do you determine compensation for what harms? And it's going to be a great discussion because now we have our community of eligibility finalized. Now that we know we're going with the lineage model, particularly those who are descendants of enslaved Africans or free Black people who were here prior to the 19th century. That is the universe of the community of eligibility. And then the economic consultants will use that community of eligibility to then construct compensation models for harms that affected that particular group of people. I would say that, I stand with all Black people and all oppressed people. And, as an advocate for social justice, I stand in solidarity and would lend myself with coming up with strategies that work to, end anti-Black discrimination more broadly, and other injuries that affect people of color. I am an ally and I'm an advocate, and I've always has been. But again, reparations for the institution of slavery, it's a specific political project. The intended beneficiaries are a specific intended group of people. And I think that's something sacred that people should respect and understand. So the next meeting will be in person, and it'll be our first in-person meeting on April 13th and 14th at Second Baptist Church, which is Vice Chair Brown's church. And there at that meeting, we'll be talking about our community engagement plan. We'll be talking about and hearing from experts and folks who can provide personal testimony on education as it affects descendants of slaves in the state. And then we'll also have planning sessions amongst the task force members so that we can plan amongst ourselves what the rest of our hearings will look like and be like. Mm-hmm. And then also, and lastly, at the April hearing, we're also going to be approving report 1. So we're issuing a 2-part report. The first report should be launched no later than June of this year, which will be around 600 pages long and delineates or documents the harms as it pertains to the descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States and California. So the first report will be released in June of this year, and it's going to detail the harms against descendants of enslaved Africans in the United States and California. And it'll also include some preliminary recommendations based on what we've learned thus far. But the second report will be where the more comprehensive reparations proposals will be outlined in detail. And those are the proposals that we will then turn to the legislature for adoption. Today's vote, I think, was a relief for me personally, particularly because I am a descendant of an enslaved African in this particular country. But then also, I was just speaking as the chairperson of the commission. Now that we have gone through this hurdle of determining who should be eligible, which has taken over 10 months to decide, I think now we can, as a task force, move on and address more complex questions, even, and more granular questions, even. In terms of eligibility, even. Like, okay, now that we know that the eligibility will be based on lineage, will you have to be a current California resident? What about California people who were born in the state but moved because they were pushed out because they couldn't afford it? Those types of questions I think are still unresolved because, this race versus lineage framework just, dominated the conversation for so long. So I'm relieved, for lack of better terms, so that now we can, move on and be more constructive with our time. Correct. The economic consultant team was waiting for direction from the task force in terms of like who should be eligible, because that's a huge part in their job in terms of like crunching the numbers. So yes, you are correct. No numbers just yet.